Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar about the Texas Outcomes-Based Finance Challenge. I'm Matt Lindsay, the Vice President of Marketing and Operations with Quantified Ventures. Our presenters today are Eric Letzinger, the CEO of Quantified Ventures, and Ben Cohen, Director of Urban and Coastal Resilience at Quantified Ventures. Before I turn it over to them, real quick, let me provide a few logistical notes. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Quantified Ventures website, along with other materials about the challenge. We do welcome your questions. We have our participants muted on audio by default. So if you have questions, if you're on a desktop or laptop, you should see a box off to the right with a few tabs, including a questions box. Feel free to type questions in there at any time. We'll be monitoring those, and during the final third of our webinar today, we'll be addressing those questions. We'll also be sure to follow up with any in writing that we don't get to on the webinar today. Again, thanks everyone, and with that, let me turn it over to Eric Letzinger.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. Hey everyone, this is Eric Letzinger with Quantified Ventures. Looking forward to a good discussion today as we launch the Texas Outcomes-Based Finance Challenge, which we're really excited about. So let's talk about what it is, what it isn't. Essentially, it's going to advance some nature-based and resilience-focused projects in the state of Texas. This is a Texas-wide challenge, and we're looking forward to working with a number of you on exciting projects that advance and resolve some environmental and community challenges. It's a competitive process, and we'll talk more about what that means and what that doesn't mean. The short answer around the competitive process, it's a very collaborative one. And so we're able to work with the applicants as you're putting proposals together, and we're looking forward to working with you throughout that process. The ballgame is that grant funding essentially covers Quantified Ventures costs to work with the selected organizations to structure these outcome-based financing vehicles. And none of this would be possible, and we're mighty grateful for the support from the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, the Hart Charitable Foundation, and Lyda Hill Philanthropies. Let's move on to the overall agenda on the next slide, if we could, Matt. So we're going to move through this fairly quickly to get through to the question and answer part, so we can have more of a conversation. But we're going to tell you a little bit about Quantified Ventures, give you a little high-level overview of what outcomes-based financing actually is. And then my colleague Ben Cohen is going to take you through a handful of case studies just to hopefully bring the abstract thinking to life a little bit. Then we're going to actually talk about the details of the initiative and the logistics associated with it, and then we'll jump into questions and discussion. Matt, we can go to the next slide. Just a little bit about Quantified Ventures. We are an outcomes-based capital firm. We provide consulting. We develop projects and partnerships to get these financial transactions off the ground. And everything that we are doing is trying to tackle impactful, getting more impactful projects on the ground. We have expertise in outcomes-based capital, and in general, we're the folks who pioneered the first environmental impact bond. We did that in Washington, D.C., and we'll take you through some of these examples. This is our fifth one of these outcomes-based finance challenges that we've done in regions. All to say, we've got some lessons learned under our belt on how to kind of make these more effective and efficient. And we're looking forward to sharing some of those lessons learned with you today. We are thrilled to be working with the Land Water Associates. Ernest Cook, more specifically, is working with us. He brings great expertise related to conservation finance opportunities and specific stakeholder needs in Texas. So we're thrilled to be working with him. Let's move to the next slide, if we could, Matt. So and again, this is just Quantified Ventures wide. None of this is new to any of you, but obviously we face some massive challenges that we're all facing around the country. We bring experience in bringing outcomes-based financing to many of these challenges, whether it's drought, flooding, groundwater depletion, coastal resilience, the need for more public parks and open space, public open space to be developed, homelessness, senior care, food insecurity. These are things that Quantified Ventures works with municipalities and public clients to resolve. All right, let's move to the next slide if we could, Matt. Real quick, so this is how we think about this stuff. We start with the general premise that we're asking quite a bit of our public sector leaders these days. The challenges that they are being asked to tackle are massive and they're complex at a time when budgets are strained. If they're going to be successful in climbing that mountain, if you will, then we're going to need to give them new ways to pay for things. And the good news is there's a interesting and growing source of capital, impact capital, which we draw on to help bring some of these stuck projects to help get on the field. And there's some flexibility with this source of capital that allows some more innovative solutions that municipalities are considering and wanting to move forward with, but maybe lack the innovative or the financial structure to make it a rational choice to move forward with innovation versus business as usual. So that is what essentially leads us at Quantified Ventures to be advancing the simple notion of outcomes-based financing, which enables municipalities to move away from having to pay for everything up front and hoping for the best, and moving to an environment where they can be purchasing outcomes on the back end. Let's move to the next slide if we could, Matt. Our offerings, so we do this in a handful of ways at Quantified Ventures. We work in a consulting environment, we work in actual project development, and we have an investment arm. Again, some of these slides we're preparing, they will be available. We're just trying to give a broad overview of who we are before we jump into it. Matt, if we can go on to the next slide, we're organized in 4 different practice areas. We have a forestry and land use practice, we have an urban and coastal resilience practice, an agriculture practice, and a health and human services practice. Interesting thing about having these 4 distinct practice areas is most of the magic comes in the overlap and the synergies across them, as most of the challenges that public sector leaders are facing don't obey the specific lines that we draw and distinctions between these issues. Matt, if we can go to the next slide, this is just a little bit of who we work with. This is a little bit of a snapshot of some of the partners that we work with. In general, we work with innovators and risk takers and pragmatists and optimists. And we're really fortunate to be working arm in arm with the folks on this logo slide here. Okay, let's go to the next slide if we could, Matt. And we're going to jump into a little bit of the deeper end of the pool and start to talk about what is this thing called outcomes-based finance. Let's move to the model on the next slide if we could, Matt. This is a terrifyingly daunting slide that looks more complicated than it is. And the basic notion here is, like I said before, we work with public entities and service providers who are providing a service or delivering an intervention or a project or a thing that produces, that shows promise to produce the outcomes that are valued by that entity there at the bottom, the public and or private entity. We refer to those entities as the payer or the outcome funder, because they're the entity that is used to paying for everything on the upfront and taking all the performance risk. And with this model, by bringing in those investors to take on some of that performance risk and take it off of the government's plate, shoulders, we're able to get more innovative projects on the field. The transaction structures that we work with to achieve this are plentiful, meaning we're not here talking about one model. We do environmental impact bonds, we do environmental impact funds, we do public-private partnerships. There are multiple ways that the financial structure can get structured, and they start with the needs of the city. And so we work backwards from that, and that will start to make a little bit more sense as Ben takes us through a couple of the case studies. Let's go on to the next slide if we could here. Let's just talk about some of the benefits of this stuff. Why do this stuff? There is this growing source of capital, this impact capital, growing at 23% a year. This is capital that municipalities need to get connected with. This is capital that wants to take some of they're aligned with the need for rigorous measurement of impact, meaning did the good thing happen, and they're willing to put their capital at risk to ensure that it does. And so these outcomes-based financing transactions for our municipal clients who we've worked with is a great way to sort of begin conversations with those impact investors, because they have historically been the ones purchasing these transactions. This is all about transferring performance risk in an innovative way off of government shoulders and onto these impact investors. This is a way to highlight and showcase partnerships on the ground. These are multi-party transactions at the core of what they are. And so showcasing those partnerships and putting them sunshine on them in a proud way is something that most of our clients have benefited from being able to do as a result of closing these transactions. These transactions create interesting bedfellows, so engaging diverse and new stakeholders who are benefiting these projects throughout this is something that our clients who have done these transactions speak about, one of the benefits that they've experienced. And then, like I said at the beginning, all of these transactions, because you've got investors essentially making a bet that the positive environmental impact or health impact or social impact will actually happen, it requires that we rigorously predict the levels of outcomes that will happen, measure the amount of that impact or outcome that is actually happening, and then report out on it publicly. And so as a result of these outcomes-based transactions, you're really contributing to the library, the open library of evidence around some of these innovative practices that we tend to focus on. So, and then this last point about establishing external accountability structures that foster commitment and support sustained partnerships, that's a lot about the ongoing reporting of how it is going, that creates environments where residents to public leaders to the partners engaged in these transactions are have a lot more sunshine on the reporting of how things are going. Okay, let's go to the next slide if we could. And this is the point in the presentation where we'll take you a little bit to the deeper end of the pool here And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Ben Cohen, who is the director of our urban and coastal resilience practice. He structured a whole bunch of these things around the country, and he'll take you through a handful of case studies to hopefully bring this stuff to life. So Ben, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and thank you to all of you who are attending. We look forward to starting conversations with you around how the projects that you're working on building out may benefit from this type of outcomes-based finance approach. As Eric laid out in that daunting diagram, outcomes-based financing essentially means just that. It differs from other types of investments in that typically it involves an evaluation of the outcomes that are actually produced from projects, and therefore builds in some accountability to the public as well as to the growing base of investors who are interested in that. And oftentimes it also contains a performance-based payment that actually ties the payment or the repayment of project financing to the success of those projects at achieving the outcomes that issuers or borrowers or other entities care about. So rather than paying for projects, you're paying for the outcomes that you ultimately care about. And so that can be beneficial in a number of ways, as Eric highlighted, including the ability to test new innovative approaches to address critical environmental and social challenges. So just as an example of that, I'll go through quickly. The first deal that we ever did was the environmental impact bond that we structured in Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. was under a consent decree from the federal EPA to manage its combined sewer overflows, which happen when there's heavy rain events and it causes raw sewage to enter into local watersheds. They had originally developed a $2.6 billion capital improvement plan that primarily consisted of gray underground storage tunnels to meet their consent decree obligations and reduce those combined sewer overflows. But in more recent years, they became interested in the role that green stormwater infrastructure can play, complementing some of the gray infrastructure, both based on its potential to be a lot more cost effective, as well as to produce a number of co-benefits to the communities where that type of infrastructure would be placed, such as improving access to green space, reducing urban heat island effects, improving air quality, as well as due to, there's lower initial capital costs typically, but there's a greater need for ongoing operations and maintenance, but that also provides the opportunity to create green jobs and workforce development opportunities around green infrastructure. And with the projects that were financed through the environmental impact bond that we helped structured in DC, DC Water actually used it as a basis to form a green infrastructure certification program to certify people in green infrastructure construction. And that protocol and certification program has now been adopted nationwide. So it's also a way to integrate, multiple co-benefits into the overall financing package for these projects. And so, as I mentioned, they became interested in green infrastructure as a solution, but at the time it had been relatively untested in DC from a hydrological perspective. They didn't know how much water could successfully be captured by these green infrastructure projects, such as rain gardens, bioswales, stormwater bump outs in the right-of-way, as compared to one of the gray infrastructure tunnels that they had planned. So they were attracted to the EIB model because it allowed them to finance a pilot program for those green infrastructure projects, 20 acres, and use the evaluation of how successfully those projects actually captured stormwater as the basis for how they would repay investors through a performance-based payment mechanism. And so what that did was that it allowed DC Water to hedge some of the risk and uncertainty around how those projects would perform. And the next slide goes into that approach in a little bit more detail. So if you thought Eric's slide was daunting, I'm sure this may be even more daunting, but at a high level, in working with DC Water and hearing out their concerns, what they were interested in, what their goals for both the projects and the project financing were, we structured this 3-tiered environmental impact bond approach where in a base case, if the projects achieve a level of stormwater capture as expected, there's no additional payment either way. DC Water just pays bond investors at a rate that was similar to its more traditional municipal issuances at the time. If the green infrastructure performs worse than expected in that low performance threshold, there's a clawback from investors back to DC Water that essentially subsidizes their interest expenses on the bond. And that comes in compensation for, on the upside, we structured it with this additional payment back to investors if the projects achieve greater than expected performance. And at first blush, I know that may seem counterintuitive. Why is DC Water paying more if the projects perform better? But really it's rooted in the cost savings that are expected by taking green infrastructure from a pilot to rolling it out into a larger program. They would be able to build less acres than they had originally expected if they have met that high performance threshold. So originally, the EPA had said that to fully replace one of the gray tunnels that they had planned, they would need to build 365 total acres. So through the demonstration pilot of 20 acres, if they show that green infrastructure is actually even more cost effective than they thought in a gallons captured or dollars per gallon captured basis, they could go back to the EPA and amend that and build less acres. So it's a way for them to share in just a portion of those cost savings expected from the full rollout of green infrastructure with investors in exchange for those investors taking on the downside risk that the projects would not perform well at all. And DC Water would have issued this bond for projects that don't really work. So this is a real case study on how this type of outcomes-based financing can help transfer the performance risk of some of those innovative types of projects. And you see on the right what those performance payments mean in the effective interest rates on the bond. Moving to the next case study. So these first few are all focused on green stormwater infrastructure and using environmental impact bonds. As we'll get to later case studies, we'll also go through other examples of outcomes-based financing that are not environmental impact bonds or don't rely necessarily on a bond issuance. But before that, so in Hampton, Virginia, we've been working with the city there to finance projects that address not only flooding from one of the local watersheds, but also from coastal flooding, which is a major challenge there, as it is along the coast of Texas and other coastal communities and geographies across the country. These were projects that had not even really been designed or fleshed out before we started working with them, but they were really attracted to using the outcomes lens that we bring in our approach to think more about how do we think and plan for projects to address resilience in Hampton in a more comprehensive way, and how do we as the city really think about and value the impacts from reduced flooding, for example. So we are in the middle of structuring an environmental impact bond there that will also evaluate and report out on the ability of these projects to manage both stormwater and coastal flooding and what that means for communities. And actually the bond resolution just passed City Council last night, and we're expecting to close and issue this by the end of the year. So we're looking at, unlike DC, we're also looking at coastal flooding and those benefits as part of these projects. The next example I'll go through, unlike the previous two, where it was projects that were planned and developed by the public agencies that we're working with, the public agencies and the utilities, we are also working in Buffalo with a little bit of a different approach. So Buffalo has now developed or implemented a number of green stormwater infrastructure projects to try to address flooding and combined sewer overflow issues there. But the need that they have to manage stormwater still exceeds the capacity from the projects that they've built already. on publicly available land. So like a lot of cities, there's not much really in the way of public land that's economically feasible to continue to build out new green infrastructure projects on. So they're increasingly looking to private properties and how can they create the right incentives to get green infrastructure installed on those properties as part of the overall stormwater management need in Buffalo. So they are using the EIB not to construct public projects directly, but to capitalize a incentive program that will pay per square footage of green infrastructure that is installed on private properties. And they're targeting mostly large commercial as well as larger multi-unit residential and industrial sites. The uncertainty here, unlike or in addition to the uncertainty in those other cities around, how well can these projects actually capture stormwater? The major uncertainty here is obviously around what is the demand for these incentive programs going to be? How many properties are going to apply for this? What types of projects are they going to propose? And what does that mean in terms of Buffalo's ability to meet its the amount of impervious acres it has set out to manage through this program? So given that that's the uncertainty there, unlike the other two where we're measuring gallons of stormwater or gallons of water that are managed, here it's around a number of impervious acres that are successfully managed through these green infrastructure projects. Again, which allows Buffalo to sort of hedge a little bit around the uncertainty for demand and the types of projects that are proposed through the program. So those are a few of our green stormwater infrastructure projects. As you saw, those are all, the city or the utilities issuing the bond themselves, but we also work on structures where there's multiple entities who are participating in the financing package. And often that's a way to, where there wasn't a vehicle for coordinated effort before, often the types of deals that we work on can help build those bridges between multiple beneficiaries of projects that may not be communicating right now, and therefore be able to offset the financial burden on any one public entity alone. So an example of that is our work in Southeast Ohio, different use case. There's a national forest there, the Wayne National Forest in Southeast Ohio, that had developed a plan to build 88 miles of mountain biking trails throughout the national forest. But unfortunately, like many national forests around the country, a lot of their budget has been diverted to fighting wildfires, and the Forest Service has limited ability to pay for these types of recreation infrastructure projects themselves. But there's a lot of expected benefits from this project, which is anticipated to be one of the premier mountain biking destinations in the country in terms of its ability to provide economic development to the region. Southeast Ohio is the poorest part of the state. It's in Appalachia. There's not a lot of resources right now, and the local governments there are actively looking for ways to transition their economy to different sectors. And tourism and outdoor recreation is one that could potentially build a lot of economic development for the region. So whereas the Forest Service didn't have the full funding to pay for the projects themselves, by taking an outcomes-based view and creating a structure where a portion of the increased tax revenues associated with increased tourism and use of the trail system and people coming to the region as a way to help pay for the project, now we have the Forest Service at the table together with both the city of Athens, Athens County, as well as some smaller villages at the trailheads of this trail system, who are all coming together now at the table to help pledge a portion of the increased tax receipts they expect to get to repay financing of this project. And it'll be evaluated based on the number of people who are actually coming to use the trail and using trail counters to do that. And through our approach, we've linked that to projections of what that does for local tax revenues. Another example of the ability of this type of outcomes-based finance approach to bring multiple parties together is our work in Colorado. So whereas all the other case studies were an environmental impact bond, which is an actual bond issued by a municipal government, in Colorado we are building a fund, and we're doing that because the issue area that we're treating here is wildfire risk reduction through forest health treatments that are thinning the density of the forest and therefore reducing risk of wildfire, and that needs to be done on an ongoing basis. So a revolving fund that we're building would help provide access to capital for the region to pay for that mitigation work on an ongoing basis, rather than a bond which pays for the projects and then it's closed out and then it's done. But similarly here, as to the mountain biking trail project, obviously wildfire risk reduction is a concern to a number of public and private entities in this region of Southwest Colorado. And so we've been working with the local county and city governments, in addition to both water and electric utilities who benefit from this risk reduction, to come up with a revolving outcomes-based fund structure where loans could be issued by the revolving fund and repaid by a multi-governmental or multi-party entity consisting of those local governments and private utilities on an ongoing basis, with the money being recycled back into the fund to pay for future work. At the same time, we're also, by taking this outcomes-based view and by thinking holistically about these projects, we're also looking at other ways to monetize the interventions that are being financed, and in particular, looking at by going into the forest and by taking down some of the vegetation, can we create revenue streams based on the sale of that material to private entities that are converting it to biomass to electricity or biochar or other products, as a way to build more revenues that will offset the financial burden on any of those public or private entities alone. At the same time, we're also leveraging funding that is available from the U.S. Forest Service, because this area is so primarily focused on an area that surrounds a national forest, the San Juan National Forest, although it's focused on private land. And we're also working with community-based organizations to secure a cost share from private landowners as well. So we're building the structure in a way that minimizes the financial burden on any of the local governments or any of the public entities alone, by crowding in multiple payers and by monetizing these other revenue streams. And the last, or I think the next slide goes over just a high-level diagram about this. So the revolving fund will initially be capitalized by a state agency issuing a bond, as well as grants and appropriations, and then be able to pay for these forest health treatments over time. And the last example that I'll go through also uses a fund approach, but rather than have it be paid for through loans like that revolving fund in Colorado, here it's more of a P3 approach, where local governments are pledging dollar per pound of nitrate or pound of phosphorus water quality outcomes to the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund in Iowa. And this is a fund that we're working on with the Iowa Soybean Association to implement better management practices on agricultural lands through Iowa, and eventually expanding throughout the Midwest. And the reason why those local governments are paying for those water quality outcomes is because they are under regulation to meet certain total maximum daily load requirements for nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, which ultimately flow into the Gulf of Mexico and cause hypoxia. And traditionally those municipalities would address those TMDL requirements by building great treatment control facilities locally within the municipalities. But ultimately, where a lot of those water quality nutrients are coming from are from upstream agricultural lands. And previously, there wasn't really a way for those municipalities to pay for projects like that. It was outside of their jurisdiction, but by taking this outcomes-based view, it allowed us to make these upstream, downstream connections, generate contracts with local municipalities who are paying for, pound of nitrogen and phosphorus avoided from these agricultural management practices, as well as crowd in and monetize other benefits from those agricultural practices. So we have some local municipalities signed up for the water quality, in addition to working with some large agribusinesses who are paying for carbon offset through these agricultural management practices. And they care about that because it helps them meet their ambitious corporate sustainability goals. So this is yet another example of how we take a pretty holistic view of, what are the types of benefits that can be generated from these projects, thinking outside the box a little from, ways that projects are traditionally funded, and being able to crowd in multiple beneficiaries, which offsets the burden on any one entity alone, which we believe, has the power to really help fill capital gaps that exist right now for a lot of these types of critical projects across a range of issue areas, while making the project financing a lot more efficient and tied to the outcomes that those payers actually care about, rather than for the projects themselves. And this is just a high-level view of the fund structure I just laid out there. So I'm happy to answer any questions about any of those case studies, but we wanted to move on to the next section, just getting down to brass tacks around the expectations of this request for statements of interest as part of the Texas Outcomes-Based Finance Challenge. So eligible applicants include a number of public and quasi-public entities, as well as other organizations working on critical issues throughout the state. We want to work with organizations that have a strong appetite for innovation, that have a financing capability, whether that means borrowing or bonding, or that means budget to pay for outcomes payments related to water quality or flood mitigation or other types of outcomes. We want to work with organizations that have buy-in from relevant stakeholders. We know that a lot of these projects can often touch a wide range of stakeholders and require that buy-in. And we're really looking for projects that are construction ready in 2021 or in early 2022. And there's a number of different types of issue areas that we're looking to work on with you, including optimization of water flows to achieve ecological outcomes, as well as water conservation and groundwater recharge, and preserving water flows for human communities as well. We're also looking at projects that address flood risk mitigation, whether that means inland stormwater flooding or coastal flooding or both, as well as water quality improvements. And finally, we're also looking at projects that address land and habitat conservation, other types of green infrastructure, as well as distributed energy generation and energy efficiency. So the next slide is just a timeline of key dates. We put in there a notice of intent to apply for October 30th. That is optional, but that helps us gauge a sense of who might be interested in ways that we might be able to work together, and allows us to continue the conversation. The final proposal is due on November 13th. I wanted to stress again that we are this is not like a federal RFP process where there's a wall between our selection team and you all who have ideas for projects or things that you're trying to work on. We really want to start conversations with you as early as and often as possible, or as you'd like, to be able to flesh out those ideas and see what might work well with this outcomes-based finance model. So leading up to the proposal submission, we encourage you to reach out to us and to work with us. The selected organizations, can you go back, Matt? The selected organizations will be notified on December 14th, and then we expect to begin work in January of next year. So with that, I'll turn it back to Matt. Here's our contact information and the link to where a lot of this information lives on our website. And again, I think we wanted to stress that we're open and looking forward to starting these conversations with you and seeing ways in which we might be able to work together in ways that this innovative outcomes-based finance approach might be able to help you implement projects that may be currently struggling for funding or financing. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Matt for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Eric. Great run through, both on the description of outcomes-based financing, quantified ventures, and getting some case studies that bring to life what the work is about. So there are a couple questions already that have been submitted. And I just encourage folks to go ahead and use the question chat to submit any other questions or ideas you have. We'll run into that. I would also note there's in the tray with the different options, there's a handout that also has a PDF if you want to download it from here. You can also get it from the website that's up on the screen with more information about the challenge. So let's jump into questions without further ado. Eric, I think I'll throw this one to you, but there's a question about, Scott had a question about just quantifying the outcomes, how they're defined by the parties, and then who's the third party evaluator. Just a little about that process.
Sure. So the process of, let's see, there's a couple pieces in there. The process of essentially selecting what the outcome metric will be that will drive the financing is a collaborative process, and a little bit of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. What we're looking for is measurements that reasonable people agree, meaning the parties around the table, that if we achieve this metric at this level, the outcome, the impact is material. And so with that, sometimes pure outcome metrics can get difficult to measure and complicated, right? And as everybody on this on this call knows, we like to look for proxy metrics, for outcome metrics that are within the domain of something that can be measured confidently, predicted confidently, reported on confidently, and the parties at the table generally believe that if we move the needle on this proxy metric, the outcome will occur. And so we've got a methodology that we take our partners and clients through to get to those happy places where we've got either a primary and maybe a secondary and sometimes tertiary metric that will drive the levels of performance and success on the projects. And that's, like I said at the beginning, that's a collaborative process that we do with all the parties at the table. And then the third party evaluator is oftentimes a local provider. Oftentimes we're tapping into local universities who can play that white hat role of, okay, this is the metric and this is how we're going to evaluate the level of performance, meaning the numbers of outcomes that will be produced. And then we're looking for a regional partner who can play that role of actually measuring success.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Very helpful. Ben, I'm going to turn this one to you. Jennifer had a question just diving into Hampton a little bit more. She noted that it's relevant to some coastal areas in Texas. And so she was just asking you to hone in a little bit on the outcomes measure used there again, and then asked if green infrastructure is the only intervention at play in the Hampton example.
All right, I was on mute. So it's the metric that's being used is gallons of water managed, and the projects that are being financed are some stream and floodplain and wetland restoration projects along a creek system flowing through Hampton. So the projects will be located both, at the point where the creek meets the bay, as well as further inland. So they're really designed to address both that coastal and inland flooding, and looking at this creek watershed at a system-wide view. So they are all green infrastructure projects, but it's part of these projects will be part of Hampton's overall resilience plan, which also includes gray infrastructure. And I think I wanted to reiterate again, like we don't see green infrastructure as superior, or that we should only be doing green infrastructure. We see it as really beneficial, as in a lot of cases, to gray infrastructure. But the performance may be a little bit more uncertain. At the same time, there's a number of additional co-benefits that may not be associated with gray infrastructure, like carbon sequestration, like habitat and biodiversity benefits, like air quality, like urban heat island effects. And those create great grounds to potentially be able to monetize some of those other benefits, which can help support the overall financing package, as sort of we've alluded to in some of these other case studies.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Somewhat related to that, Quinn and Noah both was asking somewhat related question about the investors and sort of the returns expected. So we obviously have a range of investors based on the variety of different transactions structured, but so I'll focus on Quinn's question here. Said we discussed ROI in terms of traditional muni returns. What are the timelines for a return from that investors expect in terms of, or is there a range of the timeline and the investment return expected? Eric, do you want to start on that one?
Sure, happy to. And you kind of nailed it. There's a range. I mean, if it depends on, there's a broad appetite. We have not found, we have not struggled to find investors for the transactions that we've been structuring. And a lot of our environmental bond work, for example, the rates are just commensurate with municipal bonds. And so this is not high yield money. This is not, this is impact money. And they're still investors, but they are, they're as varied amongst themselves as the projects that we work on. And so we have mostly leaned into doing this outcomes-based capital work with municipalities on faith that we will find the right investor for what ends up getting structured. And that has, to date in our 6-year history, been a good assumption that has proved out.
And just to follow up on the timeline of those returns, it is really dependent on the particular project and the issuer, if it's a bond, or the commitments for outcomes-based payments, if it's more of a P3. It's really dependent on the local context.
Great, thank you both. We have a lot of good questions coming in, so I was just trying to look through them. This is a really engaged group. There was a question about, are we looking at a minimum or maximum number of projects to pursue in Texas? I think we addressed that a little bit earlier, but it would be good to reinforce again. Eric, do you want to hit that one?
Sure. I think we have great funders at the table that have allowed us to get this all launched And so with enough confidence that we've got enough funding to actually be able to work on a handful of these in Texas, it's been really exciting we have good, active, productive, promising conversations with many other funders that are focused on these issues in Texas. Their decision-making processes are this fall. So as we move through the process and as new funders elect to participate in this initiative, then we will increase the number of projects accordingly. And it looks very promising to be able to do quite a few of these outcomes-based transactions in the great state of Texas.
Great. There's another question too, just about the size of the transactions and whether there's a particular floor or ceiling or sweet spot for from a dollar amount the size of these outcomes-based transactions. Eric, do you want to take that one first, and then Ben, you can add in if you have any.
So, yeah, Ben, why don't I hand that one to you? Because I think you're so close to so many of these that are closing here in the last couple of months and in the next couple of months. I'd be interested to see what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a strict guideline on what the range of size needs to be. Typically, we work on projects that are at least $5 million because under that, you know, doing this may not be an efficient use of time as opposed to trying to pursue grants or other funding if available. But that's, again, that's not a strict guideline, and there's not really an upper bound of what makes sense either.
Great. Mary Ann had a question, and she's, I think we've seen, there have been a couple from nonprofit entities about the process about could they submit, do they need to partner with another organization? I know you both stressed that part of this is there's a conversation process to learn more about the organization, the potential project. But I'll highlight, since we were a couple on this, Mary Ann asked about there are projects nonprofits are working on that work within the private areas, and can nonprofits be eligible applicants?
I think the answer is yes. You know, like a lot of the case studies we walked through, you know, we're primarily working with public agencies, but as in each of those deals that I just mentioned, we also often work with nonprofits and private entities who are developing projects as well, or who are stakeholders in those projects. I think we would encourage you to apply, and happy to have a follow-up call on the specific projects. We see both public agencies as well as potentially private entities as a way to as parties to these outcomes-based financing packages.
Great, thanks, Ben. There's a question I see from Craig, who's just asking a little bit about how much work needs to be done on the front end to find the outcome, the revenue that guarantees the security, and if there's a specific type of bond rating that we've found that investors are looking for. So I think that's a two-part question there. Eric, do you want to start?
Sure. I think how long do these things take to put together? It's no shorter than a standard than any other way that you would finance a project. These are not, we won't be the thing that's slowing down a public project, if that makes sense. Public projects, they're long life cycles, many steps to get through. We just run alongside that process. And the bond rating has not been a big driver of, cities choosing to move forward with this model or not. And generally, there's a price range of those bonds associated with that rating. Whether it's an outcomes-based transaction or not isn't making it more or less expensive related to that, the bond rating in place.
And just to follow up on that, so with regards to the upfront work needed on the metric, our work and our role is really to help you and help our partners think about what metric makes the most sense in terms of what is relatively simple and cheap to measure, as well as what is linked to the core outcomes that issuers care about. And so that's the work that we do through the process of working with you. So, I think it helps to have like a couple of ideas of like what that looks like and how that drives the financing. But, there's no expectations that work in particular would be up front. I think what we do kind of look for what should be up front is, again, we like to work with projects that are sort of midway through or have done at least some initial kind of planning and design. Because that helps us get a better sense of what are the costs and benefits, and we build out economic models around outcomes that can then help inform the financial model and structure.
Great, thanks, Ben. We have a couple of questions that left that we haven't gotten to. As I noted, we'll follow up in writing with everyone who asked a question. As Ben and Eric stated, this is part of starting a conversation, hearing more about your ideas and projects, and collaborating on bringing those forward. So if there are a couple of questions about specific focus areas, we'll be sure to follow that up and get back to folks. So with those, again, so if conservation easements, road safety, some of these topics, we'll be sure to get back to the folks who brought up those other areas. I guess just a kind of last question with our projects. There's a question just about the political challenges or working with the municipality. This is such a simple question to answer in 1 minute left, but how we go about doing that or work with our partners. I think it's a very collaborative approach in getting to the submissions around these proposals, and then working with the partners and the municipalities in the projects that we've brought forward, and those in case studies. Again, I think Eric and Ben addressed some of this, but Eric and Ben, if you want to add anything about any political challenges or working with in different regions and environments.
Yeah, I'll try to hit this quickly, but I think that's one of the reasons why in that eligibility list, we stress that having buy-in from stakeholders that are involved is important to help make sure the projects and the financing go through. But also, as part of our work developing this type of outcomes-based financing, really what it's about is identifying and aligning the right incentives that make sense for all the parties involved. So as part of that, we're not like shoving anything down anybody's throats. We're not trying to push a particular outcome or a particular way of seeing a project that doesn't resonate with maybe some of the other parties that are involved. We're really seeking ways to create efficient and innovative financing structures where if there are parties that are contributing to repaying financing based on outcomes, that those outcomes are ones that really make sense to them. And our work throughout the process of developing these economic models around environmental and social and economic impacts can really help build those narratives and help build bridges and identify and create incentives essentially for different parties to be able to participate. And I think we're sympathetic to the fact that these projects often require a lot of different stakeholders to be involved and to push through. And we're here to help with that process and do that.
Great, thank you, Ben. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and there's been a lot of great questions. Again, we'll follow up in writing and with the link to the webinar. We greatly appreciate everyone for joining us to learn more about the Texas Outcomes-Based Finance Challenge. And we look forward to hearing from you, working with you, collaborating with you on your ideas and projects. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Appreciate it.